I am really excited to be with you all today to talk about having an efficient, effective, and equitable Tier 2 system. I just wish I could meet you all in person, but at least we have the great capacity to be able to have a virtual conference and still connect and still engage in learning. So let's go ahead and get right started. This slide is likely familiar to most of you. It's the graphic that represents your equitable multi-level system of supports. And so for today's session, we have chosen to connect to the system's features of continuum of supports and systemic implementation, because this presentation is all about developing a system at the district and/or school level that allows for efficient, effective, and equitable decision-making at the Tier 2 level of support. Equity is at the center, as you know, of the multi-level system of supports framework, and you're going to hear equity embedded throughout this session. So watch for the symbol on those slides that really highlight equity, but it is embedded throughout the whole session. The 5-factor resource, many of you may have seen this. It's available on the Wisconsin RTI Center's website. And today our session is going to focus on factors 2 and factors 3. Factor 2 is that implementation teams are systematic and effective, and that they play an active role in supporting implementation. And that's absolutely what we're going to be talking about today. Factor 3 is that teams regularly use data to plan and make changes. And today we're certainly going to be talking about how data is essential for that efficient, effective, and equitable decision-making at both the student level as well as at the broader systems level. Okay, so here are the outcomes for our session today. By the end, we will be able to explain how an intervention grid provides that efficient, effective, and equitable Tier 2 system. We will examine the components of the intervention grid. You're actually going to practice using an intervention grid to apply decision rules. And we will each develop a concrete next step towards developing a Tier 2 intervention grid, all in an hour. So these outcomes are tied directly to 3 items on the Tier 2 scale of the school-wide PBIS Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI, like we all call it. Those items are 2.3, which is about screening, and it's about teams using decision rules and multiple sources of data. And you will really clearly see where that connection is today. 2.7 is where we want practices matched to student need and having a formal process in place to match those interventions to student need. Again, you're going to see that pretty clearly today. And the last one is around fidelity, 2.12. And this is asking that the team has a protocol for how they both collect and review ongoing fidelity data for each Tier 2 intervention. Okay, another visual that should be pretty familiar to you. It is your Wisconsin MSS Triangle. And so today's session is really going to focus here in Tier 2 in this yellow area. Okay, so I'm going out on a limb, but I think it's highly likely that we've all had many things on our mind during the past few months other than Tier 2. Then fair? So let's do a quick review of Tier 2 interventions to just get our heads back in the game and really thinking about Tier 2. So recall that Tier 2 or targeted interventions are group-based, which means that students receive similar supports based on a similar need, and they're monitored in a similar fashion. So it is always layered onto Tier 1 instruction, and it supports Tier 1. It never supplants it. We would never provide Tier 2 interventions without those students also receiving that rich universal level of support. So Tier 2 supports should always include the 6 features that you see here on the side of the screen. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll question, get you guys involved and engaged. So you heard me mention intervention grid. And so let's talk about what that is. And we're going to spend some time with this. It's a foundational tool in an intervention system or a tier 2 system. In Michigan, we kind of say intervention system. It provides an at-a-glance view of the interventions that are available or accessible for students in a school. So sort of like that menu. The intervention grid outlines really critical key information for each intervention in a school. And it's used to match kids to interventions. So those critical components, some of them are going to be familiar to you, are having a description and a purpose of the intervention. That's really important so that everybody on your staff really knows what that intervention is about. Clear entrance criteria, which some of you noted that you're using. Guidelines around permissions, whether they're needed, who's going to collect them. Progress monitoring guidelines, really important, as well as decision rules. So all of our partner districts and schools in Michigan develop this intervention grid as part of their work with us. And this is just a quick look of what one could look like. You're going to be downloading some example intervention grids shortly. So don't worry if you can't read the details of this. It's intended to just give you a quick visual of what this looks like. So when I say intervention grid, you've at least got sort of a picture in your mind of what I'm talking about. The fun part of this is it turned out to be a fancy green when I plopped it into this PowerPoint. So that was just a nice little bonus. You can see that the components that I just said, those critical components, are listed here on the left. And then on the right is where the team decisions around criteria are reflected. Okay, so in our MTSS Center in Michigan, we have a reoccurring message about the intervention system and making sure that it's set up to ensure effective, efficient, and equitable access to intervention supports within a school. So you've already heard me say those 3 E words a billion times already. And I'm going to say them many more times through the rest of this presentation, and I'm going to have you say them too. So we'll look forward to that. The power in this intervention grid is it helps neutralize our human nature that honestly often gets in the way or impacts our decision-making around kids. And if we can neutralize that a bit, it allows us to truly have a system that's effective, efficient, and equitable. So we're gonna just kind of settle in on this slide for a few minutes because this is a really critical. So let's start with effective. I don't know about you, but well, some of you said you're sitting at tables problem solving. So I spent many, many years at tables over the years as a school psychologist and in my other roles, problem solving and making decisions about individual kids. And if I'm really, really honest, which I will be, we're all friends now, we often place students in interventions, sometimes just based on what we had, even if it didn't really fit. Or maybe we thought a student, man, we think the student would really make a good connection to that interventionist. And so let's have them work together. Even if the intervention wasn't quite the right fit, we would do that. And sometimes it was simply that a student qualified for title services based on a performance on a test. And then we had maybe reading intervention X, reading intervention Y, and then like some extra tutoring. And we just kind of picked which one seemed to be the best. So one thing that I just always recall and thought about even at the time is that it seemed like the same students never seemed to get out of those interventions, like ever. They were life in the intervention. And that tells us that the interventions were not effective. And frankly, we didn't seem to have any real urgency around that. It was just sort of as if our mindset was, well, if they're in an intervention, then they're probably just always going to be a kid who needs extra help. And I'm just like, wow, and almost embarrassed by that thinking. Now what we know is we need urgency. We need to help kids close the gap quickly. And so we need to select the right intervention for the specific needs of a student based on the data about their skill or performance. And the intervention grid allows us to do that. So that's really what it's all about when we say we want our system to be effective, want it to work for kids. So the next one is efficiency. And again, when you sat around those tables, problem solving around students, have you ever done that around one particular student and it feels like it went on for years? I know I have. And I do recall a meeting that I was on, and we met over and over and over on this one kid. And it really was about, this is so crazy to say, but it really was about the student's purple sweats. And he always wore these purple sweats. And it seemed to be that there were a lot of problems that arose because of the purple sweats. And if the parents would and just a lot of that. Really weird, but true. Like, that's something you can't make up. So we spent a lot of time on that. We also had teachers like sign up for slots. So like teacher A, you're going to come and talk to us from 9:15 to 9:45. And we always seemed to run out of time before any real plan was developed. We talked a lot about the problem and a lot about the student, but the time ran out before we had a plan. So then that means teachers have to come back to another meeting. And that, of course, wouldn't be the next day. It would be a couple of weeks away. So this was just too long of a process. Students don't have the time for us to not get them into an intervention ASAP. So I hope you can relate somewhat to this. And it's just fairly frustrating. So this makes the intervention grid just super powerful. It provides clear entrance criteria for each intervention that we have in a school so that a student can be matched to an intervention in literally a matter of a few minutes after the team reviews their data. And you're going to get to practice that in a few minutes and see the power of that. And so lastly, the place where our human nature can trip us up is equitable decision making. So having entrance criteria, having progress monitoring guidelines, having clear decision rules around a student's progress allows us to make decisions based on data rather than I think or I feel. We are thinkers and feelers. For example, if I had wanted my son in my math teacher friend's really cool math intervention that she was running, even though he didn't need it, I could have gotten him into it. And another student may not have received that intervention from her because of it. Politics are at play sometimes, right? And then I had a teacher once who told me that she didn't want this student that we were working with that had huge behavioral challenges. She didn't want him in a behavioral intervention because she was worried he might improve. And she really thought his best support would be for him to move to a more restrictive setting. And she thought the intervention would prevent that. So we're human. We have this stuff occur. We have this thinking. We all have some biases, some that we know about, and some that are more implicit. And having the intervention grid established helps to neutralize our human nature and our biases, and just allows us to provide equitable access for kids to those interventions, no matter who they are. So efficient, effective, and equitable. So I know you're muted, but I want you to say this along with me. You're in your house by yourself probably, so it's okay. So say efficient, effective, and equitable. All right, thank you. I can hear you. Okay. So let's start by looking at the intervention grade component entrance criteria, which you guys are familiar with entrance criteria. Basically, they provide guidance to help us determine when an intervention may be appropriate for a student by clearly identifying data points that indicate whether the student will likely benefit from that intervention. So this gives us an efficient way to determine which intervention is likely the best match for a student's needs based on that data. We can do it really quickly, and it allows us to provide equitable access to intervention. So here's a quick example of attendance check-in. You can see the clear entrance criteria that this team set up. And so they determine that students with 4 or more absences within a marking period and a moderate or high risk level on a behavior screener called the Student Risk Screening Scale. If students had both of those, then they might be a good fit for this intervention. So teams, you'll notice as we look at grids today that teams sometimes set up an and, where they want 2 or more sets of data as entrance criteria, or an or they just list 1. It all just depends on your school and your context and your kids. So there are many possible data sources, as you know, that could be used for entrance criteria, depending on the intervention. And here's just a list of a few examples. So things like attendance or time out of the classroom or behavior screening data. Now, nominations has a question mark after it, and I noticed about 30% of you said that you use teacher or parent referrals or nominations. So there's a question after it because we want to include those in our entrance criteria just carefully and thoughtfully. So for example, how would you say no if a teacher says, I think this kid needs an intervention? Like, by which criteria are we saying no to that? It can start to push a little bit on that equitable access. So just be thoughtful around that. And one suggestion is if you include parent or teacher referral as entrance criteria, consider having a data source, having an and that would go along with it. So I'm going to take teacher referral and this set of data would be helpful for entrance criteria. Or I'm going to take parent referral and this piece of data would make our entrance criteria. Okay, so we are going to practice so you can see how this intervention grid can promote what? Efficient, effective, and equitable decisions. So here we have Lisa, and Lisa is a 3rd grade student at Anywhere Elementary. During the winter student risk screening, Lisa was identified as a student at moderate risk based on that scale's internalizing scale. In addition, she has had 3 discipline referrals in the last 6 weeks for disrespect in a variety of settings. And the perceived motivation for all of those referrals was adult attention. So I am going to pop up the intervention grid for Anywhere Elementary. So here we have it, Anywhere Elementary, here we have their grid, and we can see that we have, they have 3 interventions for behavior. They have attendance check-in, they have check-in, check-out, and they have second step for grade 6. So let me just make a couple of comments before we move forward. So in Wisconsin, I understand that for check-in, check-out, you guys put pretty much any student who needs support behaviorally in check-in, check-out first. And that's great. That's awesome. It is probably the most effective and efficient tier 2 intervention that there is. So it makes sense to start with that. And then depending on how they do, then you can layer on other interventions if need be. So in Michigan, we also have check-in, check-out as like a primary tier 2 intervention for our partners, but they aren't required to use it for every student. And so schools still use the grid to make decisions about best fit. So you might not need check-in, check-out on your grid. And then the other comment I want to make is Anywhere Elementary is using second step for 6th grade as a tier 2 intervention. They're using it for additional instruction and practice for small groups of kids that have similar needs, but it's being layered on top of using second step as universal instruction. So again, just some context into this grid. Okay, so let's go back to Lisa. Recall, I'm gonna come up here, recall that she was at moderate risk based on the SRSS internalizing scale. She's had 3 discipline referrals in a variety of settings. For disrespect is said on the slide. Okay, so we know right away, if we look at the 3 interventions, we know right away down here that second step is not going to be a fit for her. She's a 3rd grader and this is intended for grade 6. So let's start by looking at the description for attendance check-in. We can see that it's intended for kids who like or want adult attention, which that seems to fit her. But it targets increasing attendance by establishing relationships with identified adults to increase positive interactions. Students check in with that adult before the school day. If they don't check in, the adult is checking in with them or calling home. Designed for students who will not come to school and not for students with medical or other needs. So that does not sound like Lisa. There was nothing in her data that said anything about attendance. So that's probably not the best fit. So let's go to check-in, check-out and look at this. Designed for students with persistent behavior concerns that are not dangerous. That seems to fit. Her behavior is not dangerous. It provides more immediate feedback on behavior through use of the daily progress report and opportunities for positive adult interaction. We have parents participating. Students are assigned a staff member to check in and out with daily. So that's feeling like that might be a good fit for her by the description, but let's look at the entrance criteria. So notice that this team has 2 data points right here with an or. And they also have an academic distinction. They want 1 or more of the following would be entrance criteria for check-in, check-out. So let's look at this one. More than 3 ODRs. Well, she had 3 ODRs and seeking adult attention. So she's kind of there, but it says more than, and she has 3. So, and then or a moderate or high risk on this behavior screener, which she has the moderate risk. So she fits both criteria sort of there, but she definitely fits the or criteria. So, and she only needs 1. So she fits that. So this might be the best fit for her. So let's get her started. And it only took a few minutes to determine. It's super efficient. Here's the thing. Will we know for sure that it's the best fit for her? No. But we have a good chance, a better chance of having a best fit due to using these decision rules based on data. And here's the part I love, again, because we're human. It doesn't matter who Lisa is, who her family is, whether we like her or we're irritated with her or any of our personal feelings that we have just because we're humans. Our decision about putting Lisa in check-in, check-out is based on equitable decision making. Okay, so now it's your turn. If you go to the top of the page here, we did Lisa. So you are going to determine which interventions would be the best fit for Leonard and which one would be the best fit for Xander. And you can use this data and use the grid to help you make that determination. Okay, so what I would like you guys to do is if you could chat to Chat Me Content, who is Stephanie Skolasinski, and just put for Leonard, what intervention did you put him in? So for Leonard, just type in the name of the intervention and she's going to kind of give me a sense of what people are saying.
All right, I'm seeing check-in, check-out, and I'm seeing attendance.
Okay, awesome. So with Leonard, you probably can make a case either way for those 2. We wouldn't do second step for 6th grade. That's kind of rules him out. Although he is a 2nd grader or 6th grader, but he doesn't fit that. So I'm just going to kind of do a think aloud here for you. So if we look at attendance check-in, he doesn't quite meet the criteria of 4 absences in a marking period for attendance check-in. He's like almost there, right? But the most concerning data point for me when I look at that is that the 4 discipline referrals he has for tardy and disrespect all were in just the past month. So within 30 days, probably 20 days of school, right? 4 absences or 4 discipline referrals came in. So I'd want to know how many of those 4 were tardies versus disrespect. If they were mostly tardies, I might look at attendance check-in because 3 tardies, 4 tardies might equate to another absence. It's going to depend on your school. But the criteria really doesn't say that. So if we're kind of trying to stay pure to that, both attendance check-in and check-in, check-out would provide that extra attention he seems to enjoy and need. So I might start with check-in, check-out, which you guys would anyway. And if attendance didn't improve, then I might add that intervention on next. So how about Xander? Again, if you could just quickly chat, what did you decide for an intervention for Xander? When you're chatting, Chat Me Content.
So I'm seeing a lot of second step.
Perfect. Good. So 2nd step, running as a tier 2 intervention in this school seems like the best fit for Xander. He had multiple referrals for disagreements with peers, which was in the criteria. He fits one of the entrance criteria, and you only need 1 based on what this team decided for this intervention per the school's grid. So look how efficient you were. You got through 2 students in 7 minutes. And with my about 2.5 minutes of chatting about Lisa, we got through 3 students in 10 minutes. And now those 3 kids can right away go into an intervention. So that's what we want to see, is that quick response. So a couple of quick questions before I move on. And that is, one question came in, are intervention grids also established for academics? Yes, in Michigan, we have an integrated reading and behavior multi-tiered system of support, and we have intervention grids for any tier 2 intervention in the school, behavioral or academic. So for today's session, we're just showing the behavioral piece of that. The second question is, are there standard intervention grids, or who establishes the criteria that's in the grid? So what I gave you today is just an example. It's just Anywhere Elementary's example, and they set their own criteria based on their context. So I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. One is, I was working with a high school a number of years ago, and they decided for check-in, check-out that their entrance criteria was going to be 2 office referrals, and then they had some specific behaviors, but it was 2. So when they looked in their Swiss system, their behavioral data system, and they looked at, if right now we took every student who had 2 or more office referrals for these types of behaviors, how many kids does that give us? And you guys, they were a smaller high school, but it was almost half their kids. So they realized very quickly that they could not provide intervention for 50% of their students, and that they needed, first of all, to tighten up their tier 1, because it clearly was not being effective. But then they decided that they needed to up their decision rule criteria for entrance to 4 office referrals, because that would give them, when they looked at that data, about 20% of their kids, which is still a little high, but they felt like they could manage check-in, check-out for 20% of their kids. So with over time, as they strengthen their tier 1, they might be able to adjust that entrance criteria. So it's very, very contextual. In Michigan, we now are starting to have some districts that are kind of standardizing intervention grids. For example, all of the elementaries may have, 5, 6 reading interventions, and they are standardizing some of those decision rules for their elementaries with a little wiggle room for context. So that's kind of how they occur. There's no like template or sample or something that is like where you have to operate under those criterion. Okay, so efficient. We just practiced efficient, which is awesome. Okay, there we go. So now what we want to do is move into another area of the grid that's really helpful in making efficient, effective, and equitable decisions, and that is the progress monitoring guidelines. So in this section, we are clearly defining and identifying what data will be used to monitor student progress in the intervention, and what data will be used to monitor the fidelity of implementation of that intervention. And then we also often put frequency of the data collection in this section. So let's look at an example. Here's one school's progress monitoring guideline for check-in, check-out. We can see that they have decisions for both collecting fidelity data and for the student progress monitoring data. So for fidelity, they're going to use a check-in, check-out fidelity checklist, which you'll have a link to that in your resources. They're going to use that every day until 90% of fidelity of implementation is reached, and then they'll move to weekly. They want to make sure that it's being done well and done as intended. For student data, we know we have the daily progress report or the point card. That's the method of daily data collection for the student outcome data, and it will be collected by that check-in, check-out facilitator every day. This team has decided that they're going to be entering that data into check-in, check-out Swiss at least 2 times a week. And then their check-in, check-out coordinator will be looking and reviewing student data every 2 weeks. So see how clear it is. You can see who's doing it, what's being done, and how often. Now, the last area of the grid we're going to look at, this is the one that I just love, is our decision rules. I believe you refer to these as exit criteria. So the term decision rules just expands the decisions being made based on the student's pattern of their progress monitoring data to include 3 things. When will we maintain the intervention? What data pattern will tell us it's time to just maintain? What data pattern will tell us it's time to alter the intervention variables in some way? Excuse me. And what data pattern will tell us, you know what, it's time to begin to fade the student from the intervention? So this is a place, in my experience, where a lot of thinking and feeling occurs. And this is a place where it's really challenging to be efficient and equitable in our decision making without having some rules. So I'm going to model applying this team's decision rules. Again, these are the rules that this team came uh, to consensus on. I'm going to model how we would apply their decision rules to a behavior intervention for our student Bob. And so let's first take a look at those rules. So remember, we want to have definition for when do we fade, when do we alter, when do we maintain. So they're saying that to fade Bob from the intervention, and any student, we would want to see 4 weeks of data in which 4 or more days a week, the student reached their goal at 80% or higher. That's going to be a data pattern that tells us it's time to start fading. This team came up with 3 conditions under which we might alter the intervention variables in some way. And they decided that if the pattern shows that there's 3 or more consecutive data points that are below the goal line once the student has reached the goal line. So students reached it, but then it's dropped down, and 3 days in a row, they're below their goal line. And we know fidelity of implementation is verified. That's a cue that we need to alter the variables of that intervention in some way. The other alter condition, if progress on a trend line indicates that the student is going to take more than 3 weeks before they reach their goal line, and we have verified fidelity, that's going to trigger some altering of variables. And the last condition for altering is after 2 weeks, the gap between the goal line and the student's line is widening. Basically, we're making them worse. Then that's going to be where we're going to alter the variables in some way. Then by default, if we have not met fade criteria or not met alter criteria, then for the next 2 weeks or so, the student is going to continue in the intervention as is. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at Bob. Here's Bob's data, and on the right side of the screen are just the same decision rules that we just covered. So first I want to mention that when I talk about altering the intervention variables, we want to alter those in a way that does not impact fidelity of that intervention. So for example, in many behavioral interventions, we might increase the number of feedback periods. Let's say they get feedback 4 times during the day, and maybe we're going to up it to 6. That doesn't change the integrity of the intervention. It gives more support to the student, just alters it a bit. We might change the reinforcers. That's another way to alter the intervention without impacting integrity. And then notice that every alter condition says after fidelity is verified. So what we know is there's nothing magic about just putting a student in an intervention. It actually has to be provided correctly and fully in order for the student to benefit. Okay, so let's look at Bob. And here is his data, and each point, each of these blue points is data points is 1 day's worth of points for this intervention. So this phase change line right here means that this is when the intervention started for him. The red line is his goal, which you can see is at 80%. And this black line is called a trend line, and it just really shows us the general path that the data is taking over time. So what do you think about Bob? I'm just going to ask you to think about it to yourself. If you're looking at Bob's data, what do you think? So whenever I use this graph with groups and I ask what they think about and how Bob is doing, most people will say he's on the right track, like he's headed in the right direction. He has good go-upness, right? And when I ask, well, what would you do next? What would your next steps be? Most people will say they would just maintain the intervention for Bob because it's working. He's heading up. He's improving. And people will say this is our human nature, even in the presence of clear decision rules. So let's apply the decision rules to Bob's data pattern and see if we would still maintain like we think. So if we look at fade, he needs 4 weeks of data in which 4 days a week or more his goal was met. Well, he hasn't met his goal at all, so fade is off the table. If we look at the first condition of altering, if 3 or more consecutive data points are below the goal line after the student has reached the goal line, well, we can stop there because he's never reached the goal line. If progress on the trend line indicates that the student will take more than 3 weeks before he reaches his goal and fidelity is verified. So let's assume we have good fidelity of implementation of this intervention. Bob is already at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks of the intervention and he has never hit his goal. So he does meet the criteria for altering. So most people will still say, let's just give him a little more time. Like, he's so close now. And this is where our decision rules become so critical because we want him to be successful. We want to just keep going. So we need to neutralize that a little bit. So I want to just personalize it a bit. So just picture a kid in your head, like picture a Bob. And here's what happened. Bob has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I know I'm being dramatic. It's intentional. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25 days in which he has checked out. Let's say this is check in, check out, which he has checked out. And the facilitator has said, oh, you didn't reach your goal today, buddy, but man, you're close. Like, just come on, we can do it tomorrow. In 25 days, he's had to go home and tell his parents, oh, I didn't meet my goal again. And they've had to say, okay, like, you can do it tomorrow. At some point, Bob is done with this quote unquote stupid intervention. He's done. Like, this is not successful for him. So we can't just continue because we think he's almost there. Like, the decision rules will help keep us on track. Okay, so I am going to give you a quick opportunity to practice.
Stephanie,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you go back to the previous slide for a second?
Sure will, yes.
So I have somebody asking, I interpreted the second one under alter if progress on trend line indicates.
Yep.
To mean 3 more weeks to reach the goal, not from the beginning of the intervention. Can you just touch on that?
Sure, good question. It is from the beginning of the intervention. So we want, now if you remember when we looked at the progress monitoring guidelines for check-in, check-out, the sample ones, this team had decided someone was going to be looking at their intervention data every 2 weeks. And that was intentional because if the student is taking longer than 3 weeks to reach that goal, then we want to change the variables in some way. So if after 3 weeks since he started, check-in, check-out is, kids respond pretty quickly. So if after 3 weeks he has still not reached his goal, then we're going to think about, maybe we're going to change the reinforcer for him. Maybe we are going to add some feedback periods, like I said. Maybe he's a kid, we're going to bump that goal down just a little bit, 5 points or something, 5 percentage points. But somehow we have to get him successful really fast so that he learns how to self-manage over time. So yes, it is from the start of the intervention.
Okay, I do have one more question that would be good for this slide. How much data is enough for trend line interpretation?
That's a good question. So if let's say this wasn't clearly linear, let's say it was kind of all over the place right here for these first 3 weeks, but he still hadn't reached his goal, we're still going to do some altering. So his progress on this trend line is pretty, and it's by design because this makes us think, let's just keep going. But most of the time it won't be that clean. But if he's not reached his goal, then we're going to still go by those decision rules. That help?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, thanks for the questions. Okay, so let's have you look at Joanne. We're going to keep the same team decision rules just because now you're kind of learned them a little. I'm just going to give you 90 seconds to decide if this was your kiddo, if you had Joanne, would you begin to fade her from the intervention? Would you be altering the variables in some way, and you don't have to figure out how, or maintain the intervention? So go ahead, we'll put 90 seconds. Think about what you're doing for Joanne. Fading, altering, maintaining. And we're going to pop up a poll. So the poll question is, what are your next steps for Joanne? So you're going to choose that. You're going to fade, alter, or maintain. Stephanie, will you go ahead and pop that up? Thank you. Okay, so most of you, almost 80% of you will fade. A few of you are going to alter, and a couple of you, 4 of you would maintain. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to pop back, and let's just talk about her real quickly, and then we're going to move into the next closing activity. Okay, So FADE is absolutely the next steps response based on her data pattern and your decision rules. So she has 4 weeks of data, 4 or more days a week, the goal was met at 80% or higher. We're going to start to fade. Now, what I know is, again, we know Joanne. We're concerned about Joanne because many times people say, well, she's kind of trending down a little bit. But she still fits the fade criteria. And one thing that we would need to remember is she's not fading by cold turkey. She's often fading into like more self-management. We're fading some components of the intervention. Like fading takes a little bit. It's not like tomorrow she's done. So sometimes we're reluctant to let her go because we see that, well, gosh, but she had this day here. Yep. Well, that's why our fading criteria doesn't expect 5 days a week. So there's room for those days. The other reason that sometimes people will say alter is because they do see that downward trend. And maintain is often chosen because the thinking is, well, if we just gave her 1 more week so we could see what direction she was going, then that we'd be better decision makers. So I understand the responses and certainly the choices that you guys all made. But again, this is where we're going to have to fight a little bit our human nature. We're also not robots. You know, Joanne. You might have reason that you're going to do altering, but if we rely on these decision rules rather than our own thinking and feeling, we again maintain that equitable, efficient, effective, and equitable system. Okay, so again, through use of a grid, this is the tool that lets us make decisions in ways that are effective, efficient, and equitable. That's the power of it. And so we're going to return you to breakout rooms for a couple of minutes to wrap up. What we're going to have you do in your breakout room is discuss how does this intervention grid, if someone said to you, how does an intervention grid allow for effective, efficient, and equitable decisions? How would you answer that? So just chat for a minute about that. And that might ready you to share with your team when you have team time later. Secondly, to share out with your breakout room one concrete next step that you could make towards developing a tier 2 intervention grid in your district or your school. So for example, your concrete next step might be, I'm going to share this out with my team. Your next step might be, man, let's work to create a grid for at least 1 intervention in our school. Let's try this out for that. Or you might say, you know what, let's look at our interventions and let's at least get clear decision rules about fading, maintaining, and altering. So I really hope that you found time to chat together in breakouts useful, and that you identified some takeaways and some concrete next steps from today's session. All of them, sessions. There are some resources listed on the last slide, and what 2 of them are for sure are more information about applying these decision rules. One is a video that shows it's me, and it shows my thinking and kind of the decision rules and how to apply them. The other is a Word doc that does the same thing with some different data sets. And they start off pretty simple, like the ones we looked at today, but then some of them get pretty complicated. So those are resources for you. Again, I thank you so much. I had such a fun time with you today. And